Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for our online In Dialogue series. You are at the Winter Show's online dialogue series. My name is Helen Allen, and I'm the executive director of the Winter Show, America's longest running art, antiques, and design fair. The Winter Show is owned by and benefits Eastside House Settlement, a community-based organization headquartered in the South Bronx. Each year, Eastside House provides over 14,000 individuals and families with resources to reach their education and career goals. Over the course of the past 2 years, due to the ongoing spread of COVID-19, Eastside House has created new programs as well as initiated a food service program to meet the emerging needs of these families. I invite you all to take a moment to learn a little bit more about our initiatives online at eastsidehouse.org. Today, we are delighted to welcome you all for a discussion about loss and partial recovery of incredible works collected by a passionate art collector and connoisseur, Jules Strauss. Joining us are Pauline Baer de Perignon. Pauline, the great-granddaughter of Jules Strauss, has co-authored film scripts and directed writing workshops in Paris, where she lives. After discovering that her great-grandfather's collection had been in part seized by the Nazis in 1942, Pauline embarked on a journey to unveil the truth about what happened so many years ago. Her first book, The Vanished Collection, has just been published by New Vessel Press and has drawn critical accolades from Kirkus Reviews, The Washington Post, Airmail, Publishers Weekly, and several other wonderful publications. Also joining us today is Marc Masurovsky. He is co-founder of the Holocaust Art Restitution Project and has served as its director of research and is a board member. Marc has researched the question of assets looted during the Holocaust and World War II since 1980 and has worked as an expert historian on class action lawsuit for Jewish claimants seeking restitution of lost accounts and other liquid assets from Swiss banks. Previously, Marc was a consultant and historian for the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations. Since 2005, he has been managing the ERR database, which tracks art looted in Western Europe during World War II. You'll learn a little bit more about this in today's talk. Today's moderator is Michael Wise. Michael is publisher of New Vessel Press. He has worked as a foreign correspondent in Vienna, Prague, and London, reporting for Reuters and the Washington Post. He has written for many publications about culture and foreign affairs and is the author of Capital Dilemma, Germany's Search for a New Architecture of Democracy. Thank you to the American Friends of the Louvre and to New Vessel Press for their collaboration in presenting today's program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Pauline, Michael, and Marc. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. We're grateful to the Winter Show and to American Friends of the Louvre for hosting this event. The Vanished Collection is a highly readable and suspenseful book that's repeatedly been likened to a detective novel in the way that Pauline recounts her quest to understand her great-grandfather's art collection and what happened to it during the Nazi occupation of Paris, and then her success in obtaining the return of some of these works 3/4 of a century later. There are other books about Nazi art looting and restitution, but they're not generally acclaimed as charmingly told, profound, and touching, as this one has been by Lynn Nicholas, the author of The Rape of Europa, a seminal work on the topic. I hope that by attending this program, you'll get a clearer sense of the tenacious woman who wrote such an engaging account of dark history and how her investigation, with the assistance of experts like Marc Masurovsky and Nobel Prize winner Patrick Modiano, turned her from an inexperienced amateur into someone with expertise and knowledge in negotiating the often difficult and painful pathways pursued by Holocaust survivors and their descendants. Pauline, can you tell us a bit about who your great-grandfather Jules Strauss was and his importance as an art collector before the Second World War?
Yeah, now I know a little bit more about him than I did a few years ago. I discovered that he was a great collector. He arrived in France in 1881. He was only 20. He worked in a bank, and he started collecting Impressionists.
He came from Germany.
He came from Frankfurt, Germany,
Right.
exactly. And he started collecting, and he had a first sale in 1902, and he became known as Mr. Sisley. He kept on collecting all his life, but he died in 1943. And I had never heard about his collection, and I didn't know he was a donator to the Louvre too. He gave something like 60 frames to the Louvre that he chose himself according to the painting of the period he thought it would look better. He was also very curious and very fond of provenance research. So he would work on every painting to know where it came from. He was really passionate about its collection. He was what we call a horizontal collector. It means he was interested in a lot of different things. 18th century, 17th century, French, Italian, English painters, drawings, pastel from Degas. So I discovered all of this, but first I knew absolutely nothing. I don't know why my family never told me about him.
So how did you come to learn that his collection was stolen by the Nazis, or a good part of it was?
Yeah, it was really a coincidence. Now I think there are no coincidences, but I was in my 40s and I met a cousin I had only seen once or twice in my life. This cousin is called Stroz. He worked at Sotheby's for 30 years at the Impressionist department, and his father, Michel Stroz, was working there too. But we never talked about our common ancestor. And in the middle of a Brazilian concert, I don't know why, out of the blue, he told me, you know, Pauline, I think our Jules Strauss was looted.
A Brazilian jazz concert in Paris, right? Right.
So I couldn't hear very well. I didn't know what looting really meant. But then suddenly I realized, how come I never thought that as a Jewish collector, it's normal, not normal, but he was Jewish. I mean, obviously something happened to him during the war. He was very, so I started slowly to go to the libraries, to ask people, to ask Marc. And I said, okay, what happened to Jewish collectors during the war? And all this quest, all this research for 3 years led me to know a lot more about my family story, but still it was complicated to know what happened during the war, because, you know, everyone had died. My great-grandfather died in 43. So my father died, he couldn't tell me anymore. He died 20 years ago. So all I had to do to discover what happened during the war is the subject of this book. So this book is about a quest for memory and a quest for truth in a family where nobody really told me anything.
Okay, so just to clarify for the audience, you had two relatives, two cousins who were very high or very prominent people in the art world. One, your cousin Michel Strauss, who headed the Sotheby's Impressionist Modern and Contemporary Art worldwide, and the other, his son, Andrew Strauss, who was the vice president of Sotheby's for France. And still, you knew nothing really about this family history of collecting, which is very unusual.
One live in England, the other one in France. Now I understand that maybe all this silence about the past made us a bit apart in the family, you know. And now that we've discovered all these things, we are a bit more connected and we see each other much more. I think maybe it was because of this past that hadn't been told.
Okay, so Marc, can you tell us a little bit about when Pauline first contacted you, how that happened, and what kind of impression you had of the case that she was presenting to you?
You're on, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you for having me here, and sorry for this little snafu. I actually met Pauline virtually through the intercession of another scholar, Patricia Grimstead, who has authored a ridiculously massive an exhaustive census, if you want, of documents across Europe and Americas dealing specifically with cultural plunder, and particularly under this agency called the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which pretty much means Task Force Rosenberg. And it was the main agency that essentially plundered cultural objects all over Europe from Jewish families. So I get this email in May 2016 from Patricia, and then eventually I deal with Pauline. And I have to say that I didn't have the impression that Pauline was naive. I knew that she already done her homework, because the questions are ridiculously specific, but the questions that she asked were actually the questions that were very difficult to answer. And that is probably part of the bane of every single researcher, is when you finally find that crucial point for which you know you need the documents, you're not going to find them, or it's going to be very difficult to find them. So that's how our exchange began. So I tried to guide Pauline through the maze of French archives to try to find information both from the post-war, but also, more importantly, from the wartime era. And if you want me to put Jules' collection in context, it was really one of thousands of collections that have been plundered by the Nazis, and France was a particularly desired prize for the Nazis, because it was obvious that they were going to find a high concentration of works of quality, objects of quality, because keep in mind, it's not just about paintings, it's about decorative objects, furniture, libraries, textiles, musical instruments, and also ritual objects. So in fact, paintings only represent a minority of objects that were stolen by the Nazis if you look at the whole picture. What makes Pauline's case complicated, most of these plunder cases are complicated, is because Jules had objects in numerous locations. And obviously, Pauline is still trying to figure that out, because if you don't have the kinds of documents that you need to spell out very clearly where everything was, then that's really where the detective work comes in. And it's not likely that you're going to find everything, at least understand everything, but the quest yields at least enough information to get a sense as to what the magnitude of the crime was. So just to give you an example, Jules had works in a storage facility, had works in his apartment, he might have had works elsewhere. So each one of these places gets robbed and plundered, but it's not necessarily the same group that does so. And this is what makes the research even more complicated, because the crime itself was conducted both by the Germans, but also by the French, because the French were eager to get access to this property.
And his actual apartment, not only was his art plundered, but he was forced to move out of his grand apartment on the Avenue Foch and into another much smaller apartment. And that the original apartment was occupied by Gestapo forces that were involved in plundering.
Yeah, that I discovered thanks to Marc, but so that you see how little we knew in the family. When I asked my great aunt, she told me, "Oh yeah, you know, the apartment got a bit too big for them, so they had to move in somewhere else." I mean, of course, during the war, it was not the problem. He was confiscated and he had to leave the place. And the sad irony of the story is that he moved in the very place where ERR was. So imagine a Jewish collector in the building, which was 54 Avenue Dina. Yeah. So then he had to move again. So all this, I had to draw a timeline, because when you do this kind of quest, you have first to wonder what life did he have, what happened to him personally, what letters can tell me more about what happened. And then you cross it with history. And that's where Marc was so helpful. Say, oh, on that month, ERR was in that place. So that's what can have happened. That's why he left his flat at that date. You know, you have to cross all these things. And when you're a beginner in history, art history, it's really difficult and fascinating.
Marc, can you tell us a little bit about what your ERR project is and the way it digitizes all this information and helps researchers like Pauline in their investigations?
Sure, I'll give you sort of the haircut version. The project itself was the building of a database, and the purpose of the database was to basically consolidate information from primary sources. That means archival documents exclusively. And from those documents, we extracted relevant information about the types of objects that were stolen between 1940, June 1940, when the Germans were in Paris, until the summer of 1944, when they exit Paris. And also we have a section on Belgium and Holland. The whole point of this is to help people do their research and to fill gaps in the provenance, which is what Pauline was mentioning, so that there are no uncertainties about the history of these objects, because a good many of them ended up in private and public collections around the world, but mostly in the United States and in Europe. So the purpose of the database was in part to document these losses, but also to help people do research, but not only just claimants, but also museum personnel, auctioneers, gallery owners, private collectors and dealers, who would have a concern about whether the objects that they're thinking about may have been misappropriated, stolen. If they were stolen, then to make sure that they'd been restituted before they actually consider the acquisition. So in other words, it's both a historical document, a teachable document, but also a due diligence check for the market and for people involved in the trade.
Mm-hmm. So Pauline, you were able to learn that your great-grandfather, who died in 1943 in Paris, he was never deported. He was able to, he remained in his hometown with his wife, but he was having to sell or having to give up works that were stolen from him or sold at a very low price to the German authorities. After the war, you find that your great-grandmother did make an attempt to make claims to have those works restituted, but she didn't get very far. Is that right?
Well, I found them in the archives of Rose Valland. I don't want, I think we should explain in 2 words who she was. She was working, but maybe Marc would do it better than me, but she was working at the Jeu de Paume, and she wrote down all the paintings coming from Jewish collections, mostly, that passed through this place and that went to Germany, whether they were chosen by Goering or just sent there. So at the end of the war, she enabled people to know whom they belonged to. So that was really an incredible work. So what was the beginning of your question?
Your great-grandmother did make an attempt.
That's what I found first, because I think that's the first thing you have to check. Okay, if something has been looted in your family, then you go to the Archives Rose Valland and you try to find if there was a claim. And it's a very impressive and a bit sad place, because you can read all the letters from all the families after the war saying, we've lost that, we've been stolen that. You know, not only things of values, but you have all these letters. Sometimes people, they drew the furniture they had to say, okay, did you see that we've been looted that? So it was a very emotional moment where when I opened the file and I saw my great-grandmother's writing saying one chair, one package of paintings, another armchair. You know, when I saw the list, then that was the end of the doubt. I knew that we had been looted. Mm-hmm. And it was in storage. And but then still, how can you find when there's only written one package of paintings? So it was only the beginning of the complications.
Right. So her efforts were stymied to get restitution. Why do you think that other members of your family in subsequent generations were so reluctant to talk about what happened to Jules Strauss and his collection? Your cousin Michel Strauss, who, as I mentioned, became head of Sotheby's Worldwide for Impressionist and Modern Art, he wrote a memoir that was published in 2011 about his experience in the art world. And he writes about Jules Strauss's artworks, that they, quote, miraculously survived the war and were eventually recovered by my grandmother Monet after the liberation of Paris.
Yeah, I know, it's really, I don't know where this legend, it's like a legend the family, and I had to fight against it. And I asked him, and he said, I really didn't know we had been looted. You know, the silence and the denial was so strong after the war that he didn't know. And by the end of his life, we talked a lot to each other, and I'm lucky I got to know him. And he was very interested and helpful, and he wanted to know what happened. And I told him, you know, what you wrote is an obstacle for me. When I go to a museum, they just tell me, your book, can you write something else? But said, I'm sorry, I really didn't know.
Do you think that there was a feeling of shame that was at play about making claims for property when so many other people had lost their lives? Or was there also a reluctance to acknowledge the Jewishness of the family?
I think I don't know. I don't want to speak for dead people. It's too easy to explain for them. But how I see it, that it's a bit a shame and an humiliation to have been looted. My aunt tells me they were so lucky to be alive. You know, the rest was not irrelevant, but they were alive, and they had to thank God for that. I mean, that was the most important thing. They preferred to fight like in the French, les forces de l'armée française. All the cousins, all the family, they joined the force de l'armée française. You know, it was better fighting rather than
as resistance, right?
Than being only a victim of persecution.
Right. Right.
That's the way I understand things. Right. And I think keeping on claiming things to a government you don't really trust anymore because of Vichy, because of the anti-Jewish laws. I mean, after the war, you didn't, I can feel they didn't really trust the government would give them back what they asked for.
In the book, you tell a very poignant story about a phone call that you made to the son of a man who I believe knew Jules Strauss, and you ask him questions about what he might remember about your great-grandfather, and he keeps telling you that he really knew very little. Can you tell us a little bit about that phone conversation and how it ended?
I felt terrible because in my enthusiasm, I thought I would call him because I heard he was a neighbor of my family. And I called him and I told him I was just a bit too fast. I said, what do you remember? Did you go to his place? Do you remember his collection? What did you see? And by the end, he was not very nice. He said, you know, my father was deported. And I felt terrible because I should have known. I should have said, I'm sorry. I should. Of course, there's always this idea that it can be considered as not important. But to be honest, I think it's part of erasing an identity, looting
of art, right?
Yeah. So we have to take that into account too. It was the Shoah starts with looting art and taking identity and erasing people's life before you kill them. Right. So I felt terrible though.
And Marc, you have a lot of experience dealing with families that are in the situation, right?
Excuse me?
You have a lot of experience of dealing with other family members who are in the situation.
Yes, well, the thing that I wanted to mention here mostly is the reason why a lot of people didn't want to deal with restitution claims after the war, at least in Western Europe, is because, first of all, the personnel that basically was responsible for the persecution of the families was still in place. In other words, you still had the local policemen, you still had the local judges, magistrates, you still had the same bureaucrats and government agencies. So if a family had survived the war and the Holocaust and wanted to file claims, those are the people that they would be meeting. And that's the last thing that they wanted to do, is to meet their oppressors. So that basically threw a pall on the idea of filing for restitution. And as you pointed out earlier, you know, and Pauline did too, it was about surviving and being lucky to have survived. And material objects obviously take a subsidiary position. But then there is this other issue that Pauline raised, which is that by losing one's collection, you do lose part of your identity, because so much of the collector's identity is forged by bringing these pieces together as an extension of who he or she is, you know, culturally, socially, economically, and politically. And it is a status symbol. I mean, you know, it's that it is what it is. So when you remove that from the community, you're essentially committing an act of surgery. and you're telling these people that they don't have the right to collect, they don't have the right to enjoy these pieces because of who they are and what they are. And I think that's really a critical component. So when a lot of people don't file claims, it's not because they don't want to file them, it's because they realize what the challenge is. And unless they have the resources like the Rothschilds and others, and they still didn't have a very easy time of it, to fight these government officials and to hire lawyers and accountants, then you just throw the towel because you realize it's not worth it. And that's why families wake up 2 generations, 3 generations later, because the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren have the energy and they have the interest, and they can basically do what their forefathers and foremothers were not able to do because they couldn't get it together to do it. And remember, everybody's traumatized. This is the end.
There's the energy of a new and young generation, but is there something else that's changed in recent decades that made it possible for someone like Pauline to succeed in making these cases? She was certainly tenacious, but have there been other changes like the Washington Principles on Nazi confiscated art that have made it a little bit easier?
It should have, but now that you raised the Washington Principles, the basic history is that from the mid-90s up until today, there was a rekindling of interest, if you want, on what happened during the war. And it's because in part of the Swiss bank cases filed against Swiss banks that had mismanaged grossly thousands and thousands of Jewish accounts that had been left there by the victims. And they basically went to play with them after the war until somebody basically caught up with them. So it's Swiss bank cases, Lynn's book, Hector Feliciano's book called The Lost Museum. All these elements together basically conspired to create an atmosphere of, let's look at this again. But it didn't start with art. It started with all the other asset categories. And then eventually some people woke up and said, oh, what do we do about the art that's in the safe deposit boxes? Well, you basically have to treat it separately because you can't treat them like toothbrushes.
Right.
They can't, so that is sort of the way the thinking evolved. So ever since 1995, 1996, art has been on the forefront of these fights for restitution. What Stu Eisenstadt did, Ambassador Eisenstadt did in December 1998 was basically come up with a formula with the help of American museums to try to set the framework for a discussion to begin on what to do with these objects sitting in institutions. But we have to be clear about these principles. They are not a recipe for restitution. They're simply a recipe for trying to find a way out for American museums and other museums to try to deal with these objects that are obviously tainted and subject to claims.
And how many countries are signatory to that? So,
well, they quote unquote didn't sign, they basically endorsed it by being present in Washington. But we're talking about 44 countries, and only 5 of them have actually followed up on the principles by setting up commissions to deal with Holocaust era claims, specifically focused on art issues. But the overall, I guess the report card is not really great. But to go back to the initial reason for the question, yes, Pauline's task was made much easier in a certain sense because the principles opened up the forum for discussion. It didn't necessarily close it, but at the same time, it was up to each individual cultural institution to take the hint and to sit down with Pauline to have a civilized exchange, because normally it would be, well, I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but we're not going to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So what's happened in the last 20 years is a shift in that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Pauline, can you tell us about the painting that you were able to have restituted, but only after the application of strong diplomatic pressure on Germany? It's a painting that's going to be sold by your family at Sotheby's here in New York this Thursday. Can you tell us about it?
I just wanted to mention that I found about this painting. It was the first painting that belonged to Jules Strauss. I found on the Lost Art. It's a website where the German museums put when there's a gap in provenance, they put it online. But I thought, it's going to be difficult to ask the German museum. I will start with the Louvre, who kept Tiepolo drawing, because I thought, okay, that will make how do you say, it will be an example that my great-grandfather was looted, then I will go to Germany to ask them. So they gave us back this Tiepolo painting. That's
the Louvre gave back a Tiepolo painting, a Tiepolo drawing, right?
it's a drawing. It had been during the war. It had been bought by for Hitler's museum, Linz Museum.
Helen, can you show us the picture of that? I believe we have a slide from that.
Of which one?
Of the Tiepolo drawing being given back by the French cultural minister.
Hold on.
No, it was really an incredible moment because the family who my uncles, they were quite old, but they knew Jules, and seeing them during that ceremony, the ministress of culture doing this speech about Jules Strauss, acknowledging that he had been looted, that Vichy had been part of this, all this together, it was like a beautiful tribute to my ancestor, and it felt good to have this justice done. After that, I thought, okay, now maybe I can make this claim to the German museum.
In Dresden, right.
Dresden, they had on their wall, they had this beautiful painting by L'Argilière, and the last owner was Jules Strauss, and then they only knew it had been found in the 50s in the storage in Berlin, and between that they knew nothing, between 38 and 50. So there was a gap, and I realized I had to feel it myself, which is the strange thing. I had to find all the proof, you know, myself.
That painting was intended to be used to decorate the Reichsbank in Berlin originally.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. It was bought during the war by a boat I made. I don't know under what maybe Jules was not even paid. Maybe he was just forced. Maybe I don't know how it happens, but it was under persecution anyway that he had to give it away. And this lady is a red flag name. She was mentioned in, she's very well known, and even Feliciano talks about her. And she bought for a lot of art work and paintings to decorate the Reichsbank. So she's been condemned in France after the war. So I found, yeah. So
we talked about Almas Dietrich.
Sorry?
You're talking about Marie Almas Dietrich?
Not that one, Margot Jensen.
Okay.
Another less famous one, but a bit of group as well. And so I had to show all the paper. I have one thing, I'm really lucky that we still have them. My great-grandfather, he had notebooks where he would write down all he had and where it came from, where he bought them, whom they belonged to. You know, he was very fond of provenance. So obviously these notebooks that not every family keep, they helped me. And then I had to do all the journey of the painting during the war. So it took me a long time. There was a person in the museum that helped me a bit, but still it was me to show the proof. And when I finally found all I could, but with the idea, I don't know, Marc, what you think, but there's always a small gap in looting art, because nobody writes facture, nobody writes down, I gave it because, you know, so there's always this gap, and people play a bit on it. They always want more proof and more proof and more proof. And it is getting really hard for the family to do more than that. When I finally completed with hard evidence my file, I had to wait for so many decisions, but they would never tell me who decided and under what criteria. That's the difficult thing, that you don't know how they decide, you know? And I think every country has its own rules, but it's not very transparent, you know? So that's a bit difficult, and it's a bit more political than rational, I think.
So when you traveled to Dresden a few years ago and brought all of this documentation and personally met with the museum director and the curators there, what was their response? Well,
it was a very heavy meeting, because it felt like we were 70 years ago. And the director of the museum, he told me, but don't you think your great-grandfather was quite glad to sell this painting in 1941? So I was like, so I tried to stay calm. I had brought all the anti-Jewish laws, you know, proving that everything, the bank accounts were blocked, all the things that the Jewish people couldn't do and why they needed the money. But it was not nice to be in that position. And despite all the efforts I've been told they make sometimes, that time was not very easy for me. But I didn't give up. And a few other people in Germany helped me. I mean, I don't want to accuse the museum. There was a scientific director who was pro restitution. There was a research provenance lady who was very helpful. But it sounded it could have taken 20 years. And I wanted my aunt and my uncles to be still alive. So it could have a meaning to tell them, okay, I do it for you too.
Right.
So,
the federal government of Germany under Angela Merkel, after receiving diplomatic protestations from France, then also put pressure on the Dresden Museum to concede.
I got help from all embassies, French embassy in Germany, German embassy in France, CIVS, everybody was very helpful. And I must say it was the worst part. It was all this administrative impatience I felt was quite frustrating and irritating and a bit painful.
Right. So Marc, as you were saying earlier, despite the fact that there are these Washington principles, it seems that there's still a reluctance on many institutions to do the right thing and return objects once they're confronted with the documentary proof.
Absolutely, because the principles are non-binding. Mm-hmm. So you know as well as I do that unless you basically force people to do certain things, they're not going to do them. Right. Their own volition. And I think when it comes to cultural institutions, that particularly the ones that are state-sponsored, in other words, the ones in countries where there's a Ministry of Culture, which is not the case in the United States, they basically answer to the ministry. So therefore, whatever Dresden decided to do or not to do, it was basically they had to wait for orders from on high, even though they had discretion to do the right thing. And remember that they have discretion. They still need to go through a process. It's a little bit like the Louvre was the same thing. It didn't have to return it, but there's a process and it has a history of returning things, not as many as we would want, but the French government now has been, as we say in France, rodé. So it's basically used to the idea that things have to leave their museums. And it's a very painful exercise for museum directors and curators because they do have this idea that everything in the museum stays there. And it's almost like it's eternal, you know? It's a one-way street. Whatever goes in is fine, it doesn't go out. So they're going to experience this with a colonial issue. But on the Holocaust side, it's been a very, very uphill battle. And I'm sorry that Pauline had to go through this, but her story is absolutely typical.
Just today, the Louvre and Sotheby's announced that they are going to be cooperating in restitution of works. Do you see that agreement as being anything significant in terms of a different attitude?
Unfortunately, I've been in the trenches for too long, so I'm going to have to say I'll believe it when I see it.
You're waiting for actions, no?
Yes.
Rather than
action. At this point, the press conferences are nice, but we've gone through too many of them over the last 20 years, and we have to see decisive action. I mean, and it's a little bit rich coming from an auction house too, because auction houses have been some of the worst offenders in not sharing information. They're totally opaque, and it's whether they want to basically facilitate the return of the object or not. So the tables are always turned against people like Pauline, because Pauline has to do all of the work to prove the validity of her case. All they have to do is sit there and poke holes in her research, like ask questions. Well, what happened during those years for which you can't find information? Maybe he decided to do something that you're not aware of, so therefore we don't talk about theft. But no, what she's talking about is duress.
Right.
And
so
duress,
in 1941, how old was your great-grandfather? He was in his 80s, right?
In 79, yeah.
79, and he died.
He died in Paris
at age 81. 82. He died at home in his apartment from, you don't know, it could have been malnourishment, it could have been old age.
It was a bit sadness also because he lost a son, he lost a bit before the war.
Right. Right. Okay.
No, I think for me it was really important to do it myself all this process, you know, finding the proof, going to Koblenz Mobile Action Archives, learning more
Explain what that is, the Koblenz Mobile Action.
Because Mobile Action, it was an organization of looting apartments systematically. I mean, taking everything in Jewish apartments.
Furniture and
but anything, even a coffee machine. I mean, so, but the best things, the paintings, I think if I got it well, they would send it to ERR.
Correct.
But there are a lot of photos in these archives in Koblenz of the things taken by Mobile Action that I wanted to see to understand if they belong to my family, or maybe I could find something. So I went there. It was a bit difficult because not everything was translated in English. It was far from everything. And I found actually information about the Tiepolo there by miracle. I took photos of everything without understanding a word. And when I got back, it was the, how do you say facture?
The bill.
Invoice.
Invoice, yeah.
Invoice of the Tiepolo. So sometimes there are miracles when you do, but that's the thing I would like to say to other families. If you do things yourself, you're driven with your own instinct to the right places. I really believe in that. Of course, I've been very helped by Marc, and without his help, I wouldn't know so much, and it would have been impossible for me to go that fast. But it was if informations were waiting for me sometimes. You know, I went in archives and I found things, and everything seemed a bit easy, like, because it's my family, because it's my story. So I was very, I'm very optimistic for the people who do it for their own family rather than asking other people to do it. There's something waiting for them, and they will learn about their family at least. Not everything is about finding objects. It's about finding what really happened to your family.
And reconnecting with that history.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Right. Throughout the book, you talk about how this experience, you wanted to know who your great-grandfather was, to understand him as a person, to understand his,
I was obsessed with that
aesthetic
idea.
choices. Right.
Yeah, because I had a gap in my own provenance, actually, not knowing about him. I wanted to know if I was a bit like him, if I had inherited a bit of his curiosity. I was looking for some, I wanted to relate in a way. I really deeply wanted to relate, and that was the most important thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Well, I wanted to say one thing, and that is that plunder, the crime, the act of stealing somebody's property, particularly art and aesthetic objects, is really a very personal crime, and it's it really goes to the heart of everything that happened during that period of time. And by being told that you cannot have these objects, and therefore you're being told that as a human being, you can't feel the things that you feel, you can't do the things that you do out of pleasure. So I think it goes to very much to what Pauline was saying, is that it robs you of your identity. And that is something that gets missed oftentimes, but that really is what plunder is about. So when you steal from artist studios, when you steal from somebody like Jules, or you steal from a gallery, or you steal from a museum, or from a church or synagogue, that's what you're attacking. You're attacking the identity and the, if you want, the Geist of that community, of that particular person or entity. Mm-hmm. And people tend to forget this. It's not about money. It's really about, it's about rebuilding something that was absolutely wrecked.
Yeah, right.
Thank you very much. And the Vanished Collection is a beautiful act of restitution of its very own. So I think now we can start to take some questions from the audience.
Yes, there we have one was asking Pauline specifically why she decided to sell the portrait of the lady in the end. Was that a difficult decision, and what led you to that decision?
Well, you know, I had no choice because we are 19 heir now, so we can't share it. So there was really no choice about it. Yeah, it was a bit sad, I must say, because I've been looking for it for a very long time, but I'm happy that at least it can help. The money can help some people in the family who will need it for anything. I mean, it's okay.
Another question is, did Jules have a list? I mean, you talked about how he was so good at maintaining his purchases and everything, but did he have a list of what he owned that was later taken from him? And
No.
did you have any of that as proof?
Yeah, for the Tiepolo, I had a proof in the notebook because his wife, after the war, wrote on the notebook missing in red. So that was considered as a proof. But it's not that clear whether things were, he didn't do a proper list. I think he died too early to do that. He was too old and he didn't write down exactly this was looted. So that's why it's complicated job. For me, it's a lot of work, provenance work to know what has been looted.
And how many works have you been able to recover?
Just two.
Do you know where any of the other ones are? Are you in the process?
No, I have a few gaps in the provenance of a few paintings, but it doesn't mean they have been looted. I'm always very cautious. I've learned that gap doesn't mean it's been looted. So I have to work on a few paintings. But now sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes you get stuck in the middle of a research. Like people tell you, oh, the archives have burned. Oh, okay. So
Can I add something here? I think it's important for people to understand that you're working from a pre-war list, right?
Yes.
So your job, unfortunately, is to determine what Jules had and what was sold before the Germans came in.
Exactly.
And the residual is what would be subject to a possible claim or to possible misappropriation, or maybe not, because if it was hidden, then it would have survived the war. So these are all the very complicated things that unfortunately fall on your shoulders because
no, I chose to.
Yes, you took the mantle, willingly, but that is really the challenge, is to sort all that out, and it's never obvious. So that is a cautionary tale about being able to fit all the pieces together, because you probably won't be able to fit all of them.
Yeah, it's a puzzle. It's really like a puzzle.
There's a question from one of our audience members wondering if research is easier now that museums try to help. The Louvre, for example, recently hired art historian Emmanuel Polak to investigate the acquisitions made both before and after the Second World War. And this attendee also would like to also read in the art newspaper about today's announcement, I think it was today, that Sotheby's and the Louvre are collaborating. Do you think this will help? I know Marc weighed in on that one, but do you think this will help with the restitution process?
Emmanuel Polak was very helpful for me. She really, I followed her into archives. She taught me how to do research. So for me, it was a very good sign that the Louvre employed her. Then David Zivi, who's working on, how do you say MNR in English? I don't know. They are very good signs of goodwill, but the problem is sometimes they lack, how do you say, the moyens, means. Yeah, we don't have that many people working on research provenance. They don't have a lot of, the budget is quite low. So it's a lot of goodwill, but I'm like Marc now, we need evidence and actions and facts.
To be guardedly optimistic.
Yes.
In the absence of a pandemic, there are many more archives that are available where one can do research. In fact, you can probably lead 10 different lives and still not get to the bottom of this problem. The key issue and the challenge has always been, and it's something that the Washington Principles do not address, is the archives that are held by private individuals and private entities and private auction houses like Sotheby's. So in a certain sense, one has to be skeptical when the private art market joins into the to the research efforts because its own motto is not to share information. So how does the research work if you don't provide information?
Doesn't it show that they are ready to share? I mean, the announcements.
I don't know what the terms are. So,
well, I think it's a sign that
it's a good sign, but I mean, it's.
Yeah, let's wait. We don't have time to wait anymore. That's the thing, you know, it's been 80 years. We don't have that much time to wait and wait for a good announcement. We need action now.
Did you happen to find any information about the relationship of your great-grandfather and the major French art dealers such as Rosenberg, or did you
Yes,
seek help from
yes.
other descendants of French Jewish art collectors?
That was really fascinating to discover the relationship he had with Seligman, with Rosenberg. But yeah, it's all, how do you say, like a network.
Right.
And you have to work. I realized I had to work that way in order to understand how he bought things, who his friends were, how I had to get to know so many things I didn't know before in order to understand what could have happened. Did he leave paintings in art dealer's shop? All these things were important to know, but I have a lot of unsolved things.
And what about one of our attendees is asking if you could articulate the difference between looted and sold under duress. Is there a differentiation in terms of the legality of this?
Not
Maybe
anymore.
a question for Marc.
No, no.
Anything that happened between the time that the Germans entered Paris, for instance, and the time that they left, would be basically governed by duress. Duress meaning that there is no independent will that the person selling can exercise, because it's the prevailing circumstances around that person that dictates the action. So in other words, if you ask Jules whether he wanted to sell his Sisley, had the Germans not been in Paris, he might have said no. But because the Germans were in Paris and he was forced to get income from wherever source he had to, then he probably proceeded with the sale. And I'm just speculating here.
And we don't even know it happened that way.
But
Maybe it's installed, yeah.
Right. But each one of these sales has to be considered as duress unless proven otherwise. The idea of looting, well, looting can be conducted by armies, governments, etc., but all of it is by force. So it's a removal by force of property from the rightful owner to take it somewhere else. But if it's done to people of Jewish faith, then it falls under a crime against humanity. There's a different status if this affects people during the Second World War who were not Jewish, but who nevertheless lost their property to a passing army. So there are different nuances here, and the law basically looks at some of these acts somewhat differently. I'm not a lawyer, so that's my caveat, so somebody out there can correct me. But that's usually the way that I've seen it.
That kind of brings to another question that we have from one of our audience about, a little bit anyway, is there a crossover kind of with the story of the Wildenstein family, and is there any ambiguity about the role they played in looted art?
All right.
Marc, it's so complicated.
I don't want to be sued by the Wildensteins, but all I can say is the Wildensteins basically were plundered just like anybody else was. And like George Wildenstein, who was the head of the gallery in Paris, lost, I think, about 500 or 600 items that were stolen from both his residence, his gallery, and then 3 or 4 chateaus that he had in the neighborhood. The family did recover most of it, but didn't recover everything. There has been a pall of suspicion hanging over George's head and the family's heads since then, because of the intimations made by some that they were actively collaborating with the Nazis. There's no compelling evidence that actually happened, but one can also surmise that people like George may have profited from other circumstances affecting other Jewish collectors whose works would have ended up on the market, and they might have picked them up. But in that case, they're no different than any other art dealer, Jewish or not Jewish, because everyone participated in this fiesta, which consisted of buying property at low prices and basically building their collections and their inventory to sell at a future date. So in that sense, I would say that Wildenstein should not be singled out. They should just be part of a general picture of what the market was like in the 1940s.
And how does the kind of the rest of the looting or the under duress, the kind of the taking away of real estate and the restitution of real estate since the war, anything that was confiscated, what if anything do you all know about real estate restitution?
Well, the rates of restitution are really very low. In the Paris area, for instance, which I know better, I think it's about 9-10% of restitution, when you think that there are 30,000 to 40,000 buildings that were quote unquote Aryanized, in other words, whose Jewish owners were stripped of their title, and the title was transferred to someone else, not of the Jewish faith. So in general, the real estate area is actually fairly loathsome when it comes to restitution rates, and it gets worse as you go further east in Europe. And Jewish organizations have had a terrible time convincing governments in Poland, Hungary, etc., to return property that they've nationalized since 1945. So I would say that in that question is pretty appalling.
Good to know. Pauline, there's a wonderful invitation for you to speak, which I've sent to Michael, so that'll be great.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
But I think that more or less. Oh, we have one other question from earlier. Marc, you mentioned a German organization which included Rosenberg. Maybe they thought it was the ERR.
It's not the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
It's another one.
ERR. I think that's what it was. The question was, did it have anything to do with the dealer, Paul Rosenberg?
No. This is Alfred. He basically was executed in 1946 at Nuremberg.
Yeah, he was.
He was one of the bad ones.
And then I think this is just our last question, which is kind of addressed to Pauline. Could you address how this journey of discovery has changed or affected you? A small question.
Well, I think I discovered a bit more about where I come from, my identity, my origin, my maybe a bit more. I'm much more interested in my Jewish roots. I learned a lot about my family. I think I learned a little bit about myself. I didn't know I was able to do such a perseverance, do you say that in English? to do such a crazy work, and to be able to, I've always wanted to write, and I'm happy I was able to write this book about and to do this work for my family. So yeah, it changed a bit my life, I must say.
One other story, I'm seeing that some people wrote in the chat. The question is, was it difficult to find a publisher for your book? And is there a big appetite for these kinds of stories? This might be both for you and for Michael.
I didn't know there would be such an appetite, and I was completely overwhelmed when a few French publishers were interested, because it was my first book, so I was really surprised and lucky. So no, it was not too difficult. But I spent a lot of time working on it, and I didn't show it until I thought it was okay. But no, I was lucky.
We were thrilled to publish it. I read the books, I think a little bit before it actually came out in France, when the French publisher sent it to me. And I was just delighted at how refreshingly she approaches this topic, which has been dealt with by many other writers and researchers, but she brings a totally fresh and new perspective. And we're very proud to publish it.
Sure. Thank you.
That's wonderful. We have
in an excellent translation by Natasha Lehrer.
Yeah, it's incredible because she knew everything. All the people I was talking about, she had such a great knowledge of this Jewish people, but also she was really incredible. I think she knows more than I do about all this stuff.
One of our viewers said that she was questioning in the slides when I brought them up of your great-grandfather's home. Was there a Manet in the photo of the apartment with woman
yes.
in a hat?
Yeah, exactly. It's a Manet. Yeah.
She said, if that's the case, try the Cleveland Museum.
No, I know. There's one in the Cleveland Museum, but it hasn't been looted. It's been sold in 1932. But thank you, thank you.
But that was very, very sweet. I'm just looking through because I'm seeing that there were a bunch of things put into the chat. And then I think this is going to be the final question. Are you still trying to reclaim other works of art?
No, I'm not. I'm just investigating, and I will always be curious. I still need answers on provenance, but I'm not claiming anything precise right now. But I can't help trying to know a bit more about a few paintings, but I'm not certain they have been looted or whatsoever. But you know, it never ends, this kind of curiosity. N'est-ce pas, Marc?
Yes, oui. Indeed.
Indeed.
I was telling Pauline that she caught the bug. It was pretty clear.
But I'm not how do you say that, painting hunter, you know?
Mhm.
I think I wanted to know more about my family. I think there are still mysteries unsolved, but I won't keep like that with that intensity. I can't do it all my life that way. I will do it differently.
Well, I just want to thank our tremendous panelists today for a really fascinating discussion. I feel like we didn't even get to really scratch the surface, but we appreciate your time, your passion, your dedication, your expertise. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I know that some of you have been writing in that you joined late. We have recorded this discussion and we will make it available online. It will be on the Winter Show's website on the programs page. Early next week, we're going to upload some additional, with that, we'll intersperse some slides and other information so that you can have a chance to view that. Again, if you are interested in purchasing the book, we've put the links in the chat, so please check the chat. And Pauline, Marc, Michael, thank you all so much. We look forward to your success, and I hope that Thursday's sale is a tremendous success.
Thank you very much to all of you. Sorry for my English, that's not perfect, but I will try to.
English is fantastic. And we hope to see those of you that joined us today online. We hope to see you in a few weeks when we announce our new dates for the Winter Show in spring. So yeah. Thank you again, everyone, and we wish you all the best.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.